Thank you very much for having me here today. My name's Bronwen Harvey. I'm from the Australian Council for International Development Secretariat. As Murray mentioned, we're a peak body who represents over 130 members of all shapes and sizes who work in overseas aid and development. We've been around for 50 years. We were established by NGOs who were working internationally. And at the Secretariat, we administer this thing, the Code of Conduct, and I'm pretty sure this is the reason we were invited here today. This Code of Conduct is something that we provide for our members. It's been developed by our members, and it's based on their experiences of the risks and challenges of working internationally. So it isn't just something that a group of us sitting in Canberra went, I know, let's impose this requirement on our membership, but our members came up with it themselves. It includes obligations and principles about governance and financial controls. And as Stuart mentioned earlier, the ACNC has recognised the value of the ACFID code in helping charities to manage their governance and financial controls. So let's start with what we mean by good governance. For ACFID, governance includes both the structures, the board, the management team, the staff, the volunteers, and the systems, your policies and processes that shape the way your NGO operates. Regardless of the size or the nature of your organisation, good governance is characterised, we think, by the same things across all sorts of organisations. So the first of those is transparency. What the organisation ought to do, rather than just what it's expedient to do. And then doing this in a way that's internally consistent with your stated values, your policies, your procedures, and human rights. So it might be complicated to establish an overseas bank account. But if that's what you ought to do, then that's what you should do, rather than saying, oh, well, we'll just get person X to open a personal account and transfer funds into that. Ethics and integrity. What you ought to do is also about building effective and trustworthy relationships that illustrate the character and the culture of an organisation. Sorry, just jumping back to transparency. Did I say being open about about decisions and how they're made? Accountability to your external and internal stakeholders. Reporting accurately on what you said you'd do. Performance, what you actually do and the difference it makes. Using your systems and your structures to be effective. As Michael was just saying then, it's about, if what you're trying to do is reduce poverty, you've got to make sure that everything that you do is working towards that poverty reduction goal. And the compliance, meeting legal and regulatory requirements. So if these are the principles or the characteristics of good governance, how then does that, within your systems and structures, relate to financial flows, particularly for overseas transactions? Why isn't it enough just to be able to transfer funds out of the country? And the reason is because what you're trying to do is ensure that any funds that you raise or generate here in Australia end up being spent how and where you intended in your overseas destination to make the difference that you want to make. The other speakers have talked about some of the risks and the challenges, and hopefully you can see that managing risk, that vital question of asking yourself what those risks are in the first place, it's about more than just the tools that you use to move money around. It's thinking about the people and the systems that are involved in that as well. If you have good governance in place, it makes it harder for the wrong thing to happen and easier to spot it and then also correct it if it does happen. If you don't have a clear idea of what normal looks like, then how can you tell when something deviates from that norm or what you should do about it? Okay, so when we talk about governance for financial flows, there are some expectations that we would have that every organisation has got some people and structures, a board, CEO and treasury management, and these will differ depending on your size, staff and volunteers and partners, and various different systems in place that will help you to implement the decisions of all those various different people and structures. We know that for some organisations, their governance systems are more complicated than others. An NGO that employs 200 people and works in 6 different countries is going to have very different systems and structures in place compared with a small NGO who have only a volunteer staff. The systems that you have in place need to reflect your size, your structure, and your operations. Neither ACFID nor any of the other organisations who are here today would expect a small NGO to have policies and procedures in place which match the complexity of large organisations such as Oxfam or World Vision. However, regardless of size, all good governance stems from having a clear purpose, mission, and values, those foundational concepts that you put in place when you started your organisation in the first place. Not only do you need to have those concepts, but all your people, everyone you work with, needs to understand them and be committed to them. You need a board and, in the instances where you have a significant senior management team, who have a clear and strategic approach to risk and who set up the framework for good governance in your organisation. Before you accept your first donation or send your first dollar overseas, a good governance framework is going to be protecting your financial flows. An example of this would be that you might work in the area of environmental rehabilitation. So in setting up your organisation, perhaps your board said, well, we're not going to accept donations from mining companies. Maybe you're working in domestic violence prevention. Maybe you're not going to take money from breweries. So think about some of those sorts of things and whether or not your policies and processes are reflecting the values that made you start your organisation in the first place. Depending on your size, these sorts of issues might be documented in a policy, or possibly they're recorded in the minutes of the board. But either way, one of the things that you do need to do is ensure that everyone in the organisation understands that those decisions have been taken and are in place. Coming back to that transparency issue. Think about the values that inform your work. Does everyone know, for example, what your expectations are around conflicts of interest and how this might apply to them and reflect on the organisation as a whole? Your founding principles are important governance tools for you. Within the structures themselves, though, there are a range of things that will be broader than possibly you've thought about before. So let's talk about the structures and the people. Think about where the financial knowledge and responsibility sits. Most people will say, as Jeremy mentioned before, that it's the responsibility of the finance officer to manage fraud control, or maybe a treasurer, but in fact, responsibility is widespread. Good governance starts from, but doesn't stop at the top. Think about your board. Do they ask the right questions? A balance somewhere between micromanaging and leaving all the detail to staff. Those sorts of questions might include, what funds do we have to work with? How are we travelling? Have we reported to those people that we need to report to? And perhaps the occasional, why has the cost of cleaning tripled in the last quarter? Your treasurer and your CEO should have a detailed understanding of your financial position and be reporting on this regularly, both to the board and to staff. But are your treasurer and your other finance staff adequately skilled? Are they reviewing and reporting on the budget to the satisfaction of the board and staff and the AGM? Are they able and willing to answer questions on financial issues? Or do they give you the, oh, look, I'll get back to you on that one? Don't forget that even the treasurer and the finance staff do have other sources of information that they can call on. Even though we know that the external audit isn't necessarily going to tell us whether or not fraud's going on, it's still a useful check that you can call upon. What about the staff who are running projects? Do they know the processes for tracking spending? Do they know why they're tracking it? Do they know your stance on financial wrongdoing and consequences? Do they know how to report concerns? Do your partners know what your standards are? What information do you expect them to provide back to you? And why? Have you made that clear? Financial knowledge can be spread across all different levels of the organisation. Then we come to some of the systems that you have in place. Do you have clear systems in place for using and accounting for funds? They're going to differ depending on the size of and nature of your organisation, but they will commonly include things like delegations for approving transactions, bank account setups, reporting, auditing mechanisms, and developing and then monitoring the budgets that you put in place. For example, do you have fit for operations delegations? For a small organisation, you might say that transactions with a value of $5,000 to $15,000 need written approval from the CEO, and any transaction that exceeds $15,001 will need a written approval from the Board of Directors through board meeting minutes or perhaps a circular resolution. But then again, if you're the kind of organisation that is routinely spending larger amounts, that sort of financial delegation won't work for you, so make it fit for purpose. Do you have simple processes for validating partner expenditure? For example, have you got somebody who has knowledge of the local environment scanning receipts from the local partner when they're sent back to Australia and entered into your balance sheets? Do you have someone who knows that data costs in a country like PNG are 5 times what they are in Australia, and that therefore the receipts that are being submitted probably do represent actual usage and not just movie downloads? Do you have someone who knows that security costs in Afghanistan will be very different from costs for security in Fiji? Context, as Jeremy mentioned earlier, is really important in understanding what's happening in your financial flows. Do you have a system for monitoring? Do you make site visits to your partner organisations? Are they completed as part of your due diligence process? Are the findings reported back to the board? And are those reports available to other stakeholders, including your donor community? In sending money overseas, additional things to think about are the methods of transfer that work for you and the country that you're transferring to. But if you don't have a clear and agreed system, then it's going to be very difficult for you to identify when there's been a deviation from that. One of the other things that ACFID would strongly encourage is to be sure that everyone in the organisation knows who to report to or what to do if you identify financial wrongdoing. The Code of Conduct recommends that you have a complaints handling policy and that this is made known to all your staff and to partners. By writing down your approach to complaints handling, you can be sure that you've got a system in place that means when something goes wrong, people are prepared for dealing with it. If you suddenly find yourself in the middle of a complaint or an allegation of wrongdoing and you don't know where to start, it can be very confronting and very stressful for staff. So the culture of your organisation does play a key role. Are you open to finding and solving problems? Or do you have a don't ask, don't tell kind of a policy going on? Do your staff and partners know that they can report the financial wrongdoing safely? Who do they report it to? When do they report it? Do they believe they'll be listened to? Remember that diagram that we were shown before that tells us that only a very small percentage of fraud is identified through auditing, and the number of frauds that are actually identified by people noticing it and reporting on it. Okay, partnerships. A lot of organisations will say, well, does our good governance actually have to extend to our partners? Aren't we just responsible for ourselves? Michael talked about the importance of the various things that you need to think about when you're selecting your partners and undertaking your due diligence. And I'd like to just stress the value of doing that, of knowing who your partner is, knowing what their strengths are and what you can trust, and also what some of the potential weaknesses might be. You need to know the legal and the cultural aspects of the country you're working in, and you need to factor all of that into your decision making. Yes, it's a good idea to talk to others about the people you plan to work with, but third-party reports about reputation are not enough. Don't assume that if somebody has, a particular partner a proposed partner in a country has worked with another Australian NGO, that makes them all right. Or if you have an international affiliate who's worked with that partner, don't assume that makes them all right for you either. You have to do your own due diligence on these things. Think about the relationship that you have between the accountability that you have to your own donors and then to your overseas partners. We're often hearing this concern about, oh yeah, but we've got to keep our overheads down. But I think that the point that was made earlier today, that managing fraud is not an overhead, but an integral part of programming, is a really good one to bear in mind here. Remember that finance is part of relationships, and work that you put into strengthening your partner's financial systems and integrity is going to pay off in dividends for you. It allows you to manage risk, and engaging at the organisational level, not just the activity level, builds the relationship and builds strength and trust between the partners. So a couple of things to think about in relation to that. Do your partners know you? Are you clear about what you stand for and what you expect from other people? Have you and your partners mutually agreed on a process that meets both your needs? Do you have a way of monitoring what's going on there? And is that monitoring also fit for purpose? Have you, for example, required that your partners provide you with detailed and complicated reports within the contract that you set up with them, when perhaps that's not necessarily to demonstrating that the task has been performed? Your systems can be embedded into existing project management tools. So if, for example, your partner is required to report on, has within their own system a process for including information about activities in annual reports, do they need to generate a separate report for you, or can they provide a copy of their annual report to meet your needs as well as their own? Every time that you ask them to provide an extra administrative task, it's going to increase the burden on them and the burden on you in chasing it up. And again, I would stress that you should remember the value of complaints in helping you identify things that are going on. If your partner is saying to you, this is burdensome, this is problematic, then that should notify you that maybe if you don't do something about it, you're going to have risks that will turn into realities that will become problems for you. Financial transfers are a part of the larger relationship with your partners, but those relationships change and shift, and organisations mature. People come, people go. Changes may affect your partner organisation's financial processes and skills, and you can't assume that if something worked last year, it's going to work in the same way this year, or that if a potential partner was high risk 5 years ago, they're still high risk now. Remember also that when you're working internationally, you're usually working within power dynamics. Financial power can give you influence, but it can also make things more difficult for your partners and might make them wary of reporting risks before they become reality. Try and put yourself in their shoes and think about the external influences, political influences, cultural influences, that may work against them being open to reporting financial wrongdoing to you. The last point I'd make is don't reinvent the wheel. There are lots of sources of information, tools and tips to help you shape your organisation's governance and enhance good governance, regardless of how large or small an organisation is. There are a few copies of this out in the foyer, the ACFID Code of Conduct, and I would strongly encourage you to have a look at this. It's also available on the ACFID website, acfid.asn.au, and we would welcome you looking at it and having a think about it. It's not just the code, there's also some supporting guidance information there as well. And don't forget, the government is here to help. Both DFAT and the ACNC have got some fantastic resources available to help you. There are a large range of groups available too that service the needs of the not-for-profit community and who provide tools and training. Some of the ones that we often suggest to our members are Our Community, Tools for Development and Connecting Up. The final thing I would say to you is talk to other people, and you've got a huge group in this room that you can start with. You're not the only ones who are treading this pathway. There are plenty of people out there who are happy to share their wisdom with you. And if you think about the fact that the average age of the charity in Australia is 34, that's 34 years of wisdom that you can use in your own organisation immediately. Thanks.